The Franklin County Courthouse stood like a monument to justice, its gray granite walls reaching toward an overcast Columbus sky. Inside the mahogany-paneled courtroom on the fourth floor, every seat was occupied. The case of State v. Sarah Mitchell had drawn local media attention, and the public gallery was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and supporters of the accused. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor that smelled of lemon polish and old law books. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation and judgment. Sarah Mitchell sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. At 42 years old, she looked simultaneously younger and older than her actual age. The stress of the past 8 months had etched lines around her blue eyes and added a premature silver streak through her chestnut hair. She wore a modest navy blazer over a white blouse, nothing flashy, nothing to draw negative attention. Her attorney, David, had coached her carefully on appearance. "Judges and juries notice everything," he'd said. "They're already predisposed to think the worst. We need to show them a woman of integrity and character." Sarah's professional reputation was stellar. She had taught third grade at Lincoln Elementary for 17 years, never receiving a single disciplinary action. Her students adored her. Parents praised her innovative teaching methods and genuine care for each child's development. Colleagues respected her dedication and kindness, but none of that mattered now. In the eyes of the law, she was something else entirely. A woman accused of driving under the influence, a potential danger to society, a criminal defendant. The incident that brought her here occurred on a rainy September evening 6 months ago. Sarah had been driving home from visiting her sister across town. Officer James, patrolling Route 23, had pulled her over, claiming she drifted between lanes twice. The breathalyzer test showed a blood alcohol content of 0.09, just slightly above the legal limit of 0.08. What officer didn't know, what Sarah herself was still struggling to articulate, was that she hadn't consumed any alcohol that evening. The breathalyzer could be wrong, she was certain, but proving it had become the defining challenge of her life. The real problem was deeper, more complicated, and far more personal. 6 years earlier, Sarah had been in a serious car accident. A drunk driver had hit her vehicle head-on at an intersection while running a red light. The collision had been violent, terrifying, life-altering. She'd survived, but barely. The other driver had died at the scene. Sarah had spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and a severe concussion. But the physical wounds healed. The psychological wounds had not. Post-traumatic stress disorder had ravaged her mind in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Certain sounds triggered panic attacks. Sudden movements made her flinch violently. And under extreme stress, her memory became unreliable, fractured, distorted, unreachable. She'd years of therapy, taken medications, and worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. Most days she functioned normally. But when cornered, frightened, or overwhelmed, her mind became a maze of disconnected fragments. This was where justice came in. The golden retriever sat beside Sarah now, her coat gleaming despite the dim courtroom lighting. Justice was 5 years old, a fully certified service dog trained specifically to assist individuals with PTSD. The dog had come into Sarah's life 3 years ago, recommended by her therapist as a complementary treatment. Justice had transformed Sarah's existence. The dog's mere presence had a calming effect. But more than that, Justice was trained to recognize the subtle physical signs of an incoming anxiety or dissociative episode and intervene before it spiraled out of control. The dog knew specific techniques, how to ground Sarah through physical contact, how to interrupt negative thought patterns, how to bring her back to the present moment when her mind threatened to fragment. Sarah placed her trembling right hand on Justice's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur beneath her palm. The contact was immediately grounding. She focused on the tactile sensation, the softness of the golden coat, the solid structure of the dog's skull beneath, the faint pulse of life running through this creature who had become her lifeline. Justice shifted slightly, pressing her warm body closer to Sarah's leg. The dog understood that her handler was afraid. They had been through enough together to develop an almost telepathic connection. Judge Harrison sat elevated at the bench, a formidable figure in his black robes. He was 66 years old with silver hair combed back from a stern, angular face. 28 years on the bench had made him both wise and cynical. He'd seen countless defendants, heard countless stories, and learned to recognize dishonesty with near-supernatural accuracy. His penetrating gray eyes had looked Sarah up and down when she entered the courtroom, and she'd felt his skepticism like a physical weight. Judges were supposed to be impartial, but Sarah was realistic enough to know that presumption of innocence was often just a legal formality. The prosecutor, assistant district attorney, was 39 and ambitious. He had a conviction rate that had made him a rising star in the Columbus legal community. He wanted this case. Sarah's case had the makings of a straightforward DUI conviction, the breathalyzer reading, the officer's testimony about erratic driving, the police report. Believed it was an open and shut case, and his confidence showed in the way he carried himself, the way his eyes glinted with certainty. "The state calls Sarah Mitchell to the stand," announced, his voice crisp and authoritative. Sarah's legs felt weak as she stood. David squeezed her shoulder once, an encouraging gesture. Justice rose with her, moving in perfect synchronization. The dog had been carefully introduced to the court system and approved by Judge Harrison to remain in close proximity to Sarah during testimony. It was rare, but not unprecedented, for service animals to be present during legal proceedings. As Sarah walked toward the witness box, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The click of her shoes against the wooden floor sounded impossibly loud. She was aware of every eye on her, the reporters in the gallery scribbling notes, the jurors studying her face, the courthouse staff glancing up from their work. Judge Harrison's assistant administered the oath, asking Sarah to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "I do," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She settled into the witness box with Justice positioned beside the chair. The dog remained calm, alert, protective. Sarah gripped the edge of the box, the same way she'd gripped it 100 times in her nightmares about this moment. Stood adjusting his tie with practiced precision. He smiled, not a warm smile but a predatory one. The kind of smile a hunter gives to prey that hasn't yet realized it's been spotted. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "let's talk about the evening of September 15th. The evening you were arrested for driving under the influence. I'd like you to walk me through exactly what happened." The question seemed simple, but Sarah knew better. This was the moment that would determine her entire future. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The jurors' eyes narrowed with focus. Every camera lens in the gallery seemed to zoom in on her face. Sarah took a breath. She squeezed Justice's soft fur once more. The dog pressed closer, her brown eyes full of loyalty and support. And then Sarah began to speak, wasted no time with pleasantries or soft-handed questioning. As soon as Sarah had settled into the witness box and confirmed her name and occupation for the record, he launched into his cross-examination with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. "Ms. Mitchell, on the evening of September 15th, you stated in your initial police report that you were at home all evening. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady but quiet. She'd rehearsed this with David countless times. "Stay calm, answer directly, don't volunteer information. I was home most of the evening." His eyebrow arched. "Most of the evening, that's an interesting choice of words. Does that mean you weren't home for all of it?" Sarah's stomach tightened. Already she felt like she was being trapped by her own words. "I took Justice for a walk. Around 7 p.m., I think. We walked around the neighborhood for about 20 minutes. "You think," repeated, circling slowly in front of the jury box like a predator stalking prey. "Or do you know? These are important details, Ms. Mitchell. The jury needs to understand whether you're being certain or guessing." Sarah felt heat creeping up her neck. Justice, sensing the shift in her handler's anxiety, pressed her head against Sarah's leg. The contact helped, but only slightly. I'm fairly certain it was around 7 p.m., maybe 6:45. I always walk Justice in the early evening. Produced a document from his briefing case, a printout of cell phone records. He held it up dramatically for the jury to see. According to your phone provider, a text message was sent from your phone at 10:15 p.m. from a cell tower that covers Route 23. Route 23, Ms. Mitchell, is the exact location where officer pulled you over at 10:47 p.m. Can you explain how your phone pinged from Route 23 at 10:15 p.m. if you were home reading, as you claimed? Sarah's mind scrambled. She remembered texting her sister. But when? Everything felt blurry, like trying to grab smoke. The accident from 6 years ago had taught her that her memory couldn't be trusted, especially under pressure. But how could she explain that to people who thought she was just making excuses? I think I may have gone out again, Sarah said slowly, each word feeling dangerous. Maybe I needed to pick something up or visit someone. You think you went out again? His voice dripped with skepticism. So now your story is changing. Initially you said you were home all evening. Now you're admitting you left again around 10 p.m. I'm not sure of the exact time, Sarah said, her voice becoming smaller. My memory of that evening is unclear. In the gallery, Sarah could sense the shift. People were exchanging glances. Reporters scribbled faster in their notepads. The jurors' expressions hardened. What had sounded like reasonable caution in her own mind now sounded like the desperate scrambling of a guilty person caught in a lie. Judge Harrison made a note on his pad, his expression darkening with disapproval. Pressed forward, his confidence building with each of Sarah's hesitant answers. Unclear. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you've been consuming alcohol regularly for the past year? That your colleagues at Lincoln Elementary have commented on the smell of alcohol on your breath? That's completely false, Sarah said firmly, and this time her voice held more strength because she was certain of this truth. I don't have a drinking problem. I rarely drink. Yet the breathalyzer test showed a reading of 0.09. That's over the legal limit. How do you explain that? Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have a good explanation. Breathalyzers could malfunction. She could have consumed alcohol without realizing it, something in food or drink. But none of these explanations sounded plausible when spoken aloud. They sounded like the desperate lies of someone grasping at straws. I don't know, Sarah admitted, and the courtroom seemed to collectively recognize this as an admission of guilt. Smirked, he was in his element now and he knew it. Let's go back to the evening of September 15th. Officer reported that when he first observed your vehicle, you were drifting between lanes. Erratic driving, correct? I don't remember that, Sarah said. I was driving carefully. But you just admitted your memory of that evening is unclear. My memory is unclear about some things, Sarah clarified, but not about how I was driving. I know I was being careful. How can you know that if your memory is unclear? Posed the question with theatrical flair, gesturing to the jury as if to invite them to recognize the obvious contradiction. It seems convenient, Ms. Mitchell, that you remember being a careful driver but forget whether you left your house or not. You remember the time you walked your dog but forget whether you went out later. You remember being sober but had a breathalyzer reading that proved otherwise. Sarah felt tears threatening but forced them back. Crying would make her look guilty. Everything she did seemed to make her look guilty. Justice shifted, her body language changing. The dog stood and placed her paws on the edge of Sarah's lap, sensing the escalation in her handler's distress. The courtroom watched the dog's intervention with curiosity but little sympathy. Paused, satisfied with how he'd rattled his witness. Now, officer stated that when he approached your vehicle, he observed an open beer can in the cup holder. An open beer can. Do you remember that? No, Sarah said, shaking her head. There was no beer can. I don't keep alcohol in my car. Yet officer found one. He documented it. He took photographs. Produced photographs showing a beer can in a cup holder of a silver sedan, Sarah's car. Your explanation. Sarah's mind raced. She never bought beer. She rarely drank at all, but someone could have put it there, could have. But who would do that, and how could she prove it now? I don't know how that got there, Sarah said weakly. I didn't put it there. You don't know, echoed, his voice full of mock sympathy. Ms. Mitchell, on this witness stand under oath, you don't know very much, do you? You don't know if you left your house. You don't know what time you were on Route 23. You don't know how beer got into your car. You don't know why officer observed erratic driving. But you do know you're innocent. The sarcasm hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah's hands trembled. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid. The courtroom felt like it was closing in on her, the walls shrinking, the air thinning. This was what panic felt like. This was the sensation that had plagued her since the accident, the feeling that her own mind was her enemy, that her memories couldn't be trusted, that the world was conspiring against her. Judge Harrison observed her visible distress with a cold, clinical eye. I will note for the record, he announced, that the witness is displaying signs of nervousness and agitation that may indicate consciousness of guilt. The jury is instructed to consider this when weighing the defendant's testimony. The jury members leaned back slightly, their minds made up. Innocent people didn't get this nervous. Innocent people didn't have memory problems. Innocent people didn't contradict themselves. Sarah wanted to scream that her anxiety wasn't a confession, that her fragmented memory was a medical condition, not a moral failing, that her distress was real but not because she was guilty, because she was terrified, because she couldn't access her own memories when she needed them most, because her own mind had become a prison. But she couldn't say any of that, not in a way that would sound anything but desperate. Returned to his seat, confident that he'd done his job. He'd planted doubt. He'd made Sarah look unreliable. He'd positioned her as either dishonest or incompetent, and either way, she was guilty in the eyes of everyone watching. Sarah sat in the witness box, her hand gripping Justice's fur like a drowning person gripping a life preserver. The dog remained steadfast, but even her presence couldn't entirely dispel the suffocating weight of the moment. Sarah knew she was in serious trouble, and worse, she had no idea how to fix it. Wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He'd tasted blood in the water, and now he was ready for the kill. He stood again, his expression radiating confidence bordering on arrogance. Sarah watched him move, and she felt her chest tighten. Every breath felt like it required deliberate effort, as if her lungs had forgotten how to work automatically. Ms. Mitchell began, his voice taking on an even more aggressive edge. Let's focus on the most damning piece of evidence. Officer's dashboard camera shows the time stamp, 10:47 p.m. That's when he pulled you over. He documented that your vehicle crossed the center line twice in less than 2 minutes. He noted that when he approached your window, your eyes were bloodshot and your speech was slurred. He observed an open container of beer in your vehicle. And the breathalyzer confirmed what his observations suggested. You were drunk. Sarah's mouth had gone completely dry. She tried to swallow but couldn't generate any saliva. I wasn't drunk, she said, but even to her own ears, her voice sounded weak, unconvincing. Yet you've admitted you don't remember being on Route 23, continued, packing back and forth like a caged animal finally released. You don't remember leaving your house. You don't remember how beer got into your vehicle. What you're telling this jury is that you have convenient memory gaps that just happen to align with the moments that would prove your innocence. Isn't that convenient? The sarcasm dripped from every word. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably, but not in sympathy with Sarah. Their body language suggested they were leaning away from her, rejecting her, convinced of her guilt. Judge Harrison said nothing, but his disapproving stare burned into Sarah like a brand. In his eyes, she was already convicted. Sarah felt something shifting inside her mind, a familiar, terrifying sensation. The walls of the courtroom seemed to shimmer slightly at the edges of her vision. Her peripheral vision began to narrow. This was dissociation. This was what happened when her PTSD spiraled out of control. Her mind was preparing to leave her body, to retreat into some safer space within itself, abandoning her to face this alone. No, not now, not here. She couldn't let that happen. Ms. Mitchell, are you listening to me? His voice seemed to come from very far away. Yes, Sarah managed, but her voice sounded strange to her own ears, as if someone else was speaking it. Let me ask you a very specific question, said, and Sarah knew this was it. This was the moment he'd been leading toward. Where exactly were you at 10:47 p.m. on September 15th? The exact moment officer's dashboard camera time-stamped the beginning of your traffic stop. Where were you? The question seemed simple. It should have had a simple answer. But Sarah's mind had fragmented into 1,000 pieces, each one scattered in different directions. She remembered walking Justice. She remembered sitting at her kitchen table with tea. She remembered her sister's voice on the phone, or was that a different day? She remembered the terrifying flash of blue lights. She remembered officer's angry voice asking her to step out of the car. But the timeline wouldn't assemble. The memories wouldn't connect. I don't, Sarah started, but her voice trailed off. You don't know, pressed, his voice filled with theatrical disbelief. You're on trial for your freedom, Ms. Mitchell. Your entire life hangs in the balance. Your career, your reputation, your liberty. And you can't remember where you were at a specific moment on a date less than 6 months ago. I'm trying to remember, Sarah whispered, and the words sounded pathetic even to her. In the gallery, she heard the rustling of papers, the quiet murmurs of reporters. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. Every eye in that courtroom had already convicted her. The trial was just a formality now. Her hands began to shake visibly. The tremor started in her fingers and moved up through her wrists into her forearms. She clasped her hands together tightly, trying to contain the shaking, but it only got worse. Her breathing, which had already been shallow, became even more rapid and labored. Black spots were beginning to appear at the edges of her vision. This was a full panic attack. This was her nervous system recognizing a threat and going into full fight-or-flight response. Except she couldn't fight the prosecution. She couldn't flee from a courtroom. She was trapped. Justice sensed the change immediately. The dog stood, her body alert and tense, her brown eyes locked on Sarah with laser focus. She could smell her handler's adrenaline, feel the shift in her energy. Justice pressed against Sarah's leg harder, her massive body warm and solid. But even Justice's presence wasn't enough to stop the spiral. I don't remember, Sarah repeated, her voice becoming almost a sob. I know I wasn't driving drunk, I know that. But I don't remember the exact time I was on Route 23. I don't remember leaving my house. I remember fragments, but they don't connect, and I can't. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat had closed up. Tears were now streaming down her face despite her best efforts to contain them. In the jury box, she saw pitying looks mingled with disgust. She was falling apart. She was confirming every suspicion they had about her guilt. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Ms. Mitchell, I will remind you that this is a court of law. Composure is expected. His words were like ice water. They cut through her panic for just a moment. The judge thought her tears were an act. He thought her breakdown was manipulation. He didn't see a woman suffering from a legitimate neurological condition. He saw a guilty person unable to maintain her facade. Something broke inside Sarah at that moment, not in a destructive way, but in a clarifying way. She realized that no amount of logical explanation was going to help her. No matter what she said, the jury had already made up their minds. Judge Harrison was already biased against her, would twist any answer she gave into further proof of guilt. There was only one person in this courtroom who believed in her, only one being who could help her access the truth. Sarah's hand moved almost of its own volition. She reached down and gently touched the outside of her left leg 3 times in quick succession. The gesture was deliberate, specific, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking for. It was a signal she and Justice had practiced hundreds of times in her therapist's office. It was the emergency grounding technique. The signal meant, "I'm losing myself. Bring me back. Anchor me to the present." "Ms. Mitchell, I suggest you," started, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was focused entirely on Justice. The dog's reaction was immediate and practiced. Justice rose onto her hind legs with fluid grace and placed both front paws on Sarah's shoulders. The dog's warm body pressed firmly against Sarah's frame, and for 10 full seconds, Justice held the position. It was more than just physical support. It was an anchor, a connection to the present moment, a tactile reminder that Sarah was real here and not alone. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Every eye was on Sarah and Justice. No one had ever seen anything quite like this. The perfectly executed, trained intervention, the deliberate signal followed by the perfectly timed response. It was a choreography of trust, a dance perfected through months of practice. When Justice dropped back down, she immediately pressed her head deep into Sarah's lap and released a long, intentional exhale through her nose. Then the dog positioned herself slightly in front of Sarah's chair, creating a protective barrier between her handler and the prosecutor. Justice's entire body language had shifted. She was no longer a calm companion. She was an active protector, her eyes fixed on with an intensity that bordered on warning. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Judge Harrison's head snapped up from his notes. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward intently. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, from disinterested to intensely focused. Stopped mid-sentence, his confident expression faltered. For the first time in 6 months, Sarah saw something shift, something real and tangible, something that might mean her life wasn't over. Judge Harrison's hand slowly rose. And then he did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Justice's transformation was instantaneous and unmistakable. The moment Sarah's fingers made contact with her leg 3 times, the golden retriever's entire demeanor shifted from calm companion to active interventionist. Every muscle in the dog's body tensed with purpose. Her ears perked forward. Her eyes, which had been soft and gentle, became laser-focused on her handler's face. The dog rose smoothly onto her hind legs with the grace of an athlete executing a practiced move. Justice's front paws lifted off the ground, and she placed them directly on Sarah's shoulders with controlled precision. This wasn't an enthusiastic jump or an affectionate greeting. This was a trained medical response. The dog's paws were placed with exact purpose, neither too high nor too low, perfectly positioned to create maximum grounding contact through deep pressure therapy. Justice held the position for exactly 10 seconds. Anyone who knew about service dog training would recognize the deliberate timing. This wasn't random. This was protocol. The deep pressure of the dog's weight on Sarah's shoulders had a specific neurological effect. It activated the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's natural calming mechanism. It was the same principle behind weighted blankets and compression therapy, but delivered by a living, breathing, warm presence that was infinitely more powerful than any inanimate object. During those 10 seconds, Sarah felt something fundamental shift. The panic that had been consuming her began to ebb. Her racing heartbeat slowed incrementally. The black spots at the edges of her vision retreated slightly. The dissociative sensation that had threatened to completely disconnect her from reality began to reverse. Justice's weight, Justice's warmth, Justice's unwavering presence was literally pulling her back from the brink of psychological collapse. In the gallery, a woman in the 3rd row leaned toward her companion. "That's not just a dog," she whispered. "That's trained intervention, service dog training. My sister has PTSD and her dog does the same thing." The word spread through the courtroom like electricity through a circuit. Service dog, training, medical response. Suddenly, what people had been witnessing shifted from sentimental pet behavior to something far more significant and deliberate. Had frozen mid-step, his mouth slightly open. For the first time since the trial began, his confident expression cracked. He wasn't sure what he was watching, but he instinctively recognized that something had just shifted in his favor or against him. He just wasn't certain which. Judge Harrison's head tilted slightly, his sharp eyes tracking Justice's movements with the intensity of a scientist observing a crucial experiment. His expression remained neutral, but his entire body language had changed. He was no longer dismissive or disdainful. He was engaged. When Justice completed the 10-second hold, she lowered her front paws back to the ground with controlled precision. But she didn't simply step back and resume her previous position. Instead, Justice immediately dropped her head down into Sarah's lap, pressing her muzzle firmly against her handler's legs. The dog's breath was deep and intentional, a long, deliberate exhale that seemed to calm the entire courtroom just by the sheer evidence of the dog's controlled composure. This was a specific technique used in PTSD service dog training. By pressing her head into Sarah's lap and breathing deeply and slowly, Justice was teaching her handler's body to mirror the dog's respiratory pattern. Sarah's shallow, panicked breathing began to synchronize with Justice's deeper, slower breaths. It was a physical form of biofeedback, one of the most effective grounding techniques in the entire service dog arsenal. Several jurors were now leaning forward with genuine interest rather than judgment. This wasn't manipulation. This wasn't an act. This was something real and measurable and trained. Justice remained in the position for approximately 30 seconds, her breathing continuing to be slow and deliberate. Sarah could feel her own nervous system responding to the dog's calmness. It was as if Justice was lending her own parasympathetic nervous system to Sarah, as if the dog's calm was contagious and could be transferred through physical contact. Then, with the precision of an athlete executing a choreographed routine, Justice rose and positioned herself directly in front of Sarah's witness box chair. The dog stood broadside, her body creating a physical barrier between Sarah and the prosecutor. This wasn't aggressive. Justice made no threatening sounds or movements, but it was unmistakably protective. The dog's eyes fixed on with an intensity that conveyed a clear message: "You've pushed enough." Several courtroom observers later described this moment as haunting. The dog wasn't attacking. She wasn't even growling, but her entire presence radiated a protective fierceness that couldn't be ignored. Justice's stance said, "This person is under my protection, and I will not allow further harm." A recess reporter in the back of the courtroom whispered urgently into her phone, "Something extraordinary just happened. The defendant's service dog has just performed what appears to be a full trained intervention sequence. This isn't an emotional support animal. This is a working medical alert dog." The energy in the courtroom had transformed completely. Where there had been judgment and skepticism, there was now curiosity and uncertainty. The jury members were exchanging glances, not glances of condemnation, but glances of dawning realization. Perhaps they'd misunderstood something. Perhaps the defendant wasn't as guilty as they'd believed. Sarah, meanwhile, was experiencing a clarity she hadn't felt in the past 6 months. Justice's intervention had literally reset her nervous system. The panic was still present in her body, but it was no longer in control of her. The dissociation that had threatened to pull her away from reality had been interrupted and reversed. Her breathing was steady. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her mind was still fragmented, but manageable, like a puzzle with some pieces missing, but with enough pieces in place to see the overall picture. Sarah placed her hand on Justice's head, feeling the solidity of the dog's skull beneath her palm. The contact grounded her further. She made eye contact with Judge Harrison, and for the first time she saw something different in his expression. Doubt, perhaps, reconsideration, a crack in his certainty of her guilt. Attempted to continue his cross-examination. "Ms. Mitchell, I still need you to." But Judge Harrison raised a single hand, silencing the prosecutor mid-sentence. "I think," the judge said slowly, his voice carrying a note of command that could not be questioned, "that we need to take a brief recess." His eyes widened. "Your Honor, I was in the middle of—" "I'm aware of what you were doing, Mr." Harrison interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Bailiff, we'll adjourn for 30 minutes. The bailiff stood. "All rise." As the courtroom erupted in confused murmurs, Sarah sat in the witness box with justice pressing against her leg. The dog's intervention had bought her something precious: time, and more importantly, it had bought her credibility. Judge Harrison was looking at Sarah and Justice with an expression that suggested he was seeing them, truly seeing them, for the first time. His eyes had shifted from judgment to investigation, and in that shift lay the first real hope Sarah had felt since her arrest. Justice rested her head on Sarah's lap, her mission complete. She had saved her handler not with violence or aggression, but with precision, training, and unwavering loyalty. And now, finally, someone important had noticed. Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers, his judicial robes draped over the back of his leather chair. His desk was meticulously organized, case files stacked with precision, photographs arranged in neat rows, his computer monitor positioned at exactly 90 degrees to his line of sight. In 28 years, he developed a reputation for order, control, and unwavering certainty. He could read people. He could spot lies before they fully formed on a defendant's lips. He was rarely wrong. But today, he was beginning to suspect he might have been profoundly wrong. He pulled up the court recording on his computer and rewound to the moment when Sarah Mitchell made that deliberate gesture to her leg. He watched it again, frame by frame. 3 touches. Quick, precise, intentional, not random, not habitual. This was a signal, and what came next confirmed it. The dog's response was remarkable. Harrison had seen service animals before, mostly K-9 units and disability assistance dogs in the courthouse, but he'd never witnessed anything quite like Justice's choreographed intervention. The dog had moved with purpose, with training, with the kind of precision that could only come from hundreds of hours of professional conditioning. Deep pressure therapy. That was the term that came to Harrison's mind. He'd read about it once in a legal brief involving a veteran with PTSD. The weight of the dog on the handler's shoulders activated the body's calming response. It was legitimate neuroscience, not mysticism. And then the head pressing into the lap, the controlled breathing. That wasn't comfort. That was medical intervention. That was a trained response designed to regulate someone's nervous system. The judge leaned back in his leather chair and rubbed his temples. In that moment, Sarah Mitchell's fractured testimony took on entirely new meaning. Her memory gaps weren't signs of deception. Her anxiety wasn't consciousness of guilt. Her breakdown wasn't an act. What he'd witnessed was a woman with a documented medical condition struggling to access her memories under extreme stress. And when she couldn't manage it alone, a professionally trained dog providing the neurological intervention necessary to help her function. The implications were staggering. Harrison had presided over this trial with the assumption that Sarah was guilty. He'd let that assumption color every question, every expression, every note he took. When she became anxious, he'd interpreted it as guilt. When her memory faltered, he'd seen it as dishonesty. When her dog intervened, he'd finally seen the truth he'd been missing all along. He stood and walked to his window, looking out over Columbus. The city spread below him like a map of his authority. He'd made thousands of judicial decisions, and he was confident in most of them. But this one was different. This one had the potential to destroy an innocent woman's life. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Harrison called. His law clerk, a bright young man named Daniel, entered with a stack of documents. "Judge, I pulled those files you requested, the defendant's medical records and the service dog certification documents." "Thank you, Daniel," Leave them on my desk." As the clerk departed, Harrison picked up the medical file. Sarah Mitchell's psychiatric evaluation was thorough and detailed. Complex PTSD from a traumatic motor vehicle accident 6 years prior, documented memory dissociation under stress, anxiety disorders, treatment history spanning years, therapy records, medication prescriptions. It was all there, professionally documented by licensed psychiatrists and clinical psychologists. This woman had been fighting an invisible battle for 6 years. The service dog certification was equally impressive. Justice was registered with a legitimate, nationally recognized service dog organization. Her training had cost over $30,000. The certification showed that Justice was trained specifically for PTSD intervention, with expertise in deep pressure therapy, grounding techniques, and anxiety interruption. The documentation included case studies of other handlers Justice had been trained with, all showing similar patterns of successful intervention. This wasn't a pet. This was a medical device in the form of a living creature. Harrison reviewed the training logs. Justice had over 2,000 documented hours of training. Her handler, Sarah, had demonstrated proficiency in the prearranged signals, including the 3-tap signal that Harrison had just witnessed executed flawlessly in the courtroom. The judge sat back down, feeling the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. How many times had he dismissed PTSD as an excuse? How many times had he told himself that if someone couldn't remember things clearly, they must be lying? How many of his judicial decisions had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of neurological conditions? He checked his watch. The recess would be ending in approximately 10 minutes, but Harrison had no intention of resuming normal proceedings. Not yet. Not until he understood what he'd failed to see earlier. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Bailiff, I need to see both counsel in my chambers before we resume. Now." Within 5 minutes, David and were standing in Harrison's office. Looked hopeful. He seemed to sense that something had shifted. Looked wary, as if sensing that his advantage had evaporated. Harrison began, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. "I need to ask Mr. some questions about his client's service dog and medical condition." Started to object. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Sit down, Mr." Harrison interrupted quietly. "I'm not asking." Stepped forward. "Of course, Your Honor, I have her complete medical documentation." "I've read it," Harrison said, gesturing to the files on his desk. "I want you to explain what I witnessed in that courtroom, the gesture, the dog's response. I want to understand exactly what happened there." For the next 20 minutes, explained Sarah's condition in detail. The trauma of the accident, the way PTSD affected her memory, particularly under stress, the years of therapy and medication, the breakthrough of finding justice, the specific training protocols, the signal system he and Sarah had developed with her therapist to help the dog intervene at the critical moment before Sarah's panic completely spiraled. "She knew she was going to fall apart," said quietly. "She's been working with her therapist for 3 years to manage these episodes. When she felt the panic beginning to overwhelm her on the witness stand, she used the signal to ask Justice for help. Justice has performed that exact sequence of interventions literally hundreds of times." Harrison listened without interrupting. With each detail, his certainty crystallized further. He'd made a terrible error in his initial assessment. He'd convicted this woman in his mind without understanding her. "The prosecution's evidence," Harrison said slowly, turning to, "relies heavily on the defendant's apparent dishonesty and her memory inconsistencies. But if those inconsistencies are symptoms of a documented neurological condition, then the prosecution's entire case is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. Isn't that correct?" His face had gone pale. "Your Honor, the breathalyzer reading is still valid evidence." "The breathalyzer reading is valid," Harrison agreed, "but it's only one piece of evidence. And if the defendant's anxiety and memory issues are symptoms rather than signs of guilt, then we need to everything else. He turned back to, I'm going to restart this trial with clear instructions to the jury that the defendant's anxiety and memory inconsistencies may be symptoms of a documented medical condition, not indicators of guilt. I'm also going to allow the defendant to testify again, this time with her service dog providing active support. The jury needs to understand what they're actually witnessing. Thank you, Your Honor, said, relief flooding his face. Looked like he'd been physically struck. His case was unraveling before his eyes. Harrison stood, his decision made with the absolute certainty that comes from finally seeing the truth. We reconvene in 5 minutes. This trial is going to proceed very differently from this moment forward. As the two attorneys left his chambers, Harrison looked back at the video of Justice's intervention. 28 years on the bench, and he just learned the most important lesson of his career. Sometimes what looks like guilt is actually suffering. Sometimes what appears to be dishonesty is actually disability. And sometimes a dog understands the truth that the law had failed to see. The courtroom was packed when they reconvened. Word had spread through the courthouse that something significant was happening. Reporters refreshed their phones obsessively, trying to catch every detail. The gallery filled with courthouse staff who had found excuses to leave their offices. This trial, which had seemed straightforward hours ago, had suddenly become something far more complex and compelling. Sarah sat at the defense table with Justice pressed against her leg. She felt different now, calmer, steadier, anchored by the dog's steady presence and by Judge Harrison's unmistakable shift in demeanor. Where there had been cold judgment, there was now carefully neutral attention. That was progress. Judge Harrison called both attorneys to the bench. The jury was sequestered in the jury room, unaware of the extraordinary developments happening in their absence. What came next would determine whether Sarah got a fair trial or whether the existing prejudices would continue to poison the proceedings. Mr. Harrison began, his voice controlled but carrying undertones of intense interest. I'd like to hear, in detail, about your client's medical condition and her service dog's training. And I want to hear it now on the record before we proceed further. David stood, appearing composed but with a faint smile of relief crossing his features. Your Honor, I have extensive documentation. First, regarding my client's medical condition, she was diagnosed with complex PTSD following a severe motor vehicle accident in 2019. The accident involved a head-on collision with a drunk driver who was traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour. My client sustained severe injuries including broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and a traumatic brain injury. Produced a thick medical file. She spent 3 weeks hospitalized and an additional 2 months in intensive outpatient rehabilitation. Her neuropsychological evaluation from Dr., who is board-certified in clinical neuropsychology, documents the specific nature of her cognitive injuries. He opened to a particular page and began reading. The patient demonstrates consistent difficulties with memory encoding and retrieval, particularly under conditions of high stress or perceived threat. These memory disruptions represent trauma-induced neurological changes, not malingering or deception. The patient's anxiety response is proportional to her documented history of near-fatal trauma. Leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. Your Honor, this is entirely irrelevant. The breathalyzer reading is objective scientific evidence. I'm not finished, said firmly. Your Honor, my client's condition is not merely psychological, it's neurological. The traumatic brain injury she sustained altered the structure and function of her hippocampus and amygdala, the brain regions responsible for memory formation and threat assessment. Under stress, these regions become hyperactive, causing the exact symptoms we witnessed on the witness stand. He turned to face Harrison directly. Now, regarding Justice, this is a fully certified service dog trained by Premier Service Dogs, an organization accredited by the International Association of Canine Partners. The certification confirms that Justice has completed over 2,000 hours of specialized training in PTSD intervention protocols. Produced Justice's certification documents, which he handed to the judge. Justice's training includes several specific interventions. The first is deep pressure therapy, applying weighted pressure to the handler's shoulders to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. The second is the technique you witnessed, where the dog places her head in the handler's lap with controlled breathing to teach respiratory biofeedback. The third is environmental scanning, the dog remaining alert to potential threats while the handler regains emotional equilibrium. Harrison examined the documents carefully, occasionally nodding. And the signal, the 3 taps on the leg. Your Honor, that's a prearranged distress signal that Sarah and Justice have practiced with her therapist, Dr. Ellen, for over a year. When Sarah activates that signal, Justice immediately initiates the full intervention protocol. It's not random behavior. It's a trained medical response, as documented and as any pharmaceutical intervention. Pulled out additional documents. I have doctor's treatment notes, Justice's training certifications, video recordings of Justice successfully performing these interventions in therapeutic settings, and detailed neuropsychological testing results showing my client's condition and her specific disability-related memory deficits. Stood abruptly. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is emotional manipulation. The defendant is using a dog as a prop to make herself seem sympathetic. The facts remain. She was pulled over for erratic driving, her vehicle contained an open beer container, and the breathalyzer showed she was intoxicated. Precisely, countered, his voice rising with intensity. And now we need to examine those facts in the context of what we actually know about my client's medical condition. The erratic driving that officer observed, was that actually erratic, or was it a symptom of anxiety triggered by her PTSD? The police report states she crossed the center line twice in 2 minutes. That's the driving pattern of someone experiencing acute anxiety, not necessarily someone under the influence. The breathalyzer started. Can malfunction, interrupted. Additionally, my client may have been exposed to alcohol without knowingly consuming it. There are documented cases of people testing positive after consuming non-alcoholic beer, certain mouthwashes, or after consuming food prepared with alcohol. The prosecutor's case is built entirely on assumptions, not facts. Judge Harrison held up a hand, silencing both attorneys. The breathalyzer reading is objective evidence, mister. I won't dismiss it entirely. However, mister, you're right that we need to consider the context. The judge turned his full attention to the prosecution. Mister, in your opening statement, you suggested that the defendant's anxiety and memory problems were indicators of guilt. You told the jury to interpret her emotional distress as consciousness of guilt. But what if her emotional distress is actually a symptom of her documented medical condition? What if her memory problems aren't dishonesty, but disability? His face flushed. Your Honor, I didn't have access to this information when I examined the defendant. This appears to be information that should have been disclosed earlier. Objection, said immediately. The defendant's medical information was provided to the prosecution in discovery 3 months ago. The defense team has been transparent about the PTSD diagnosis and the service dog certification from the beginning. Harrison's eyes narrowed. He made a note, his disapproval of implication evident in the way his pen pressed hard against the paper. I see. So you did have access to this information, mister. His mouth opened and closed. Your Honor, the implications weren't clear at the time. The implications are clear now, Harrison said coldly, and they fundamentally change how we must evaluate the defendant's testimony. He turned back to, Mister, you're asking me to believe that your client's memory inconsistencies aren't dishonesty but neurological symptoms, that her anxiety isn't guilt but disability, that the signal to her dog was a legitimate request for medical intervention. I find the evidence compelling. The documentation is thorough. The service dog certification is legitimate. Made one last attempt. Your Honor, even if we accept all of this, she still tested positive on the breathalyzer. That's objective evidence of intoxication. It is, Harrison acknowledged. But I'm going to allow the defendant to testify again, this time with clear jury instructions that her anxiety and memory difficulties may be symptoms of her documented medical condition. I'm also going to allow her service dog to provide active support during her testimony. The jury needs to understand what they're actually witnessing, not an act of desperation, but a legitimate medical intervention. He looked at both attorneys in turn. Additionally, we're going to have the breathalyzer calibration records examined by an independent expert. Officer's dashboard camera footage is going to be reviewed by someone qualified to analyze driving patterns. And we're going to examine the beer can evidence more carefully. Fingerprint analysis, chain of custody documentation, everything. Your Honor began, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Harrison interrupted. I made assumptions about your client's character based on incomplete information. I interpreted her medical condition as deception. That was a grave error in judgment on my part. I'm correcting that error now because the evidence demands it. But we still have a trial to complete, and the jury will make the final determination based on all available evidence. He raised his voice so the bailiff could hear. Bailiff, bring the jury back in. We have significant new information that must be presented before we continue. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She reached down and pressed her hand to Justice's head. The dog leaned into the touch, her tail wagging slightly. Had gone pale, his confidence completely shattered. His case, which had seemed so solid that morning, was now crumbling like sandstone in the rain. And in the gallery, reporters were already composing headlines. Judge Halts' trial to examine service dog evidence in DUI case, and disability advocate or manipulation. The Sarah Mitchell trial takes shocking turn. For the first time since her arrest, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to believe that justice might actually prevail. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a decisive crack that echoed through the courtroom. This trial is suspended for 72 hours pending independent expert review of critical evidence. The jury is sequestered during this period. Both counsel will cooperate fully with the court-appointed experts. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, already on their phones with their networks. The jury filed out, confused but following orders. And Sarah sat in stunned silence, her hand still pressed against Justice's warm fur, trying to process what had just happened. David leaned over and whispered, "You did it. You actually did it. Justice did it." Sarah shook her head. "It's not over yet." "No," agreed, "but the playing field just leveled. More than leveled, it tilted in your favor." Over the next 3 days, the courthouse transformed into a scientific investigation zone. Judge Harrison had appointed Dr. Robert, an independent expert in forensic toxicology and breathalyzer calibration, to examine officers' equipment and the testing procedures used on the night of Sarah's arrest. Doctor's first discovery came within hours. The breathalyzer had been calibrated 2 weeks prior to the arrest, which was within acceptable parameters. However, the device had been used 17 times in the 6 days between calibration and Sarah's test. Without proper maintenance between uses, breathalyzers can drift, occasionally producing false positive or false low readings. More significantly, discovered that the breathalyzer in question had a known history of producing elevated readings. In fact, the specific model had been the subject of 2 lawsuits in other states regarding accuracy. It wasn't definitive proof that Sarah's reading was inaccurate, but it raised serious questions about the reliability of the prosecution's primary piece of evidence. Simultaneously, Security camera footage from the Route 23 corridor was being reviewed by Dr. No relation to David, an expert in driver behavior analysis and accident reconstruction. He watched the dashcam footage from Officer's patrol car with fresh eyes and from the perspective of someone trained to recognize the difference between drunk driving and anxiety-induced driving patterns. Erratic driving typical of intoxication is characterized by overcompensation, Doctor explained in his preliminary report. The driver makes large steering wheel corrections in the other direction. Anxiety-driven driving, by contrast, shows smaller, more frequent micro-adjustments. The driver is of lane position and making constant small corrections. He reviewed the footage frame by frame. The vehicle in question, Sarah's silver sedan, showed exactly what would be expected from someone experiencing acute anxiety, not intoxication. The lane drifts were minor. The corrections were subtle and frequent, not the wild typical of impaired drivers. Additionally, Doctor noted, the driving speed was maintained at exactly the posted limit throughout the observed period. An intoxicated driver typically shows more significant speed variations. This driver is demonstrating hypervigilance, not impairment. Meanwhile, in a different part of the courthouse, financial forensics expert Dr. Jennifer Martinez was examining phone records with painstaking detail. Sarah had originally told Officer that she was home all evening, which was technically inaccurate because she'd taken Justice for a walk. But the phone records revealed something far more interesting. Sarah's phone had pinged cell tower 23B at 7:14 p.m. and remained connected to that tower until 7:43 p.m., the exact duration and location consistent with a neighborhood walk. The phone then pinged Tower 15A, the one covering Sarah's residential address, from 8:04 p.m. until 10:09 p.m. That's a location consistent with being at home. But the critical ping, the one from Route 23 at 10:15 p.m., was anomalous. Dr. Martinez traced the signal and discovered something extraordinary. The phone had pinged Route 23 tower, but only for 73 seconds. Not only that, the signal came from the exact location of a major shopping center where Sarah's sister worked. The shopping center had a pharmacy that dispensed medication, and Sarah had a prescription that needed refilling. Dr. Martinez pulled the pharmacy records with a warrant. Sarah had indeed filled a prescription for anxiety medication on September 15th at 10:16 p.m., just after the phone ping. The pharmacy records showed the transaction was initiated at 10:16 p.m. and completed at 10:23 p.m. Sarah had driven to the pharmacy, run in for approximately 7 minutes, and was heading home when Officer pulled her over at 10:47 p.m. So where was the beer, the crucial missing piece? Officer's body camera footage showed him discovering the beer can in the cup holder, but the chain of custody documentation was incomplete. The photographs of the beer can showed no fingerprints, unusual for a used beverage container that someone had supposedly been drinking from throughout the evening. Standard evidence protocol required fingerprint analysis, but Officer had logged the beer can as found evidence without processing it for fingerprints. Doctor's forensic analysis revealed even more damaging information. The beer can contained exactly 8 ounces of liquid, the full amount of an unopened beer. If Sarah had been drinking from it, the can would have been partially empty. Additionally, the placement of the can in the cup holder showed no residue or moisture patterns consistent with having been driven around for hours. The can appeared to have been placed there recently, within minutes of being discovered. By the end of the 72-hour investigation period, the prosecution's case had fundamentally transformed. The objective evidence of guilt was now shrouded in reasonable doubt. The breathalyzer reading was questionable. The driving pattern was consistent with anxiety, not intoxication. The phone records confirmed Sarah had a legitimate reason to be on Route 23, and the beer can itself was suspicious in its too perfect presentation. On the morning when the jury was brought back in, Judge Harrison addressed them directly. "Members of the jury," he began. "During this trial suspension, the court has discovered information that significantly impacts how you must evaluate the evidence. I am instructing you that the defendant suffers from complex PTSD resulting from a traumatic motor vehicle accident. This is a documented medical condition that causes anxiety and memory disruption under stress." Several jury members shifted in their seats, their expressions shifting from judgment to consideration. The defendant's service dog, Justice, is a fully certified medical alert animal trained to intervene when the defendant's anxiety becomes overwhelming. The intervention you may observe, or that was described in testimony, is not emotional comfort. It is a legitimate medical response, equivalent to an injection of insulin for a diabetic or an inhaler for an asthmatic. I am instructing you to interpret the defendant's anxiety and memory difficulties not as indicators of guilt, but as symptoms of her documented medical condition. Sat motionless, his face ashen, he knew what was coming next. "Additionally," Harrison continued, "independent experts have reviewed the breathalyzer device and found it to be potentially unreliable. Dashboard camera analysis suggests the observed driving pattern is consistent with anxiety, not intoxication. Phone records indicate the defendant had a legitimate reason to be on Route 23 at 10:15 p.m. And forensic analysis of the allegedly incriminating beer can raise significant questions about how it came to be in the defendant's vehicle." The judge paused, letting the weight of this information settle. "Mister, you may proceed with your case. And Mister, I recommend you carefully consider your position before continuing with this prosecution." Sarah felt Justice press against her leg, the dog's tail beginning to wag. In the gallery, Dr. Ellen, Sarah's therapist, was crying openly. David had his head in his hands, overwhelmed with the sudden reversal of fortune. The game hadn't just changed. The entire board had been flipped over and rearranged. And for the first time, Sarah Mitchell wasn't the defendant in a rigged trial. She was a victim, a person suffering from a genuine medical condition, and a woman who had finally found someone willing to listen and understand. Justice rested her head on Sarah's lap, her mission to bring truth into the courtroom finally bearing fruit. The jury had been deliberating for 14 hours spread across 3 days. Sarah sat in the courthouse cafeteria with David and Justice, drinking coffee that had long gone cold. Every hour that passed without a verdict felt like another day added to her sentence. She knew logically that the evidence now supported her innocence, but logic held little comfort against the deep-seated fear that had lived in her chest since her arrest. Justice rested her head on Sarah's lap, the dog's brown eyes occasionally checking in on her handler. Even with all the positive developments, Sarah's anxiety remained elevated. Justice was programmed to recognize her handler's stress, and the dog remained in a state of heightened alert, ready to intervene at a moment's notice. "They're taking their time because they're being thorough," said, though his own nervousness was evident in how many times he checked his phone. "That's actually a good sign. Juries that convict quickly often do so out of bias. Juries that take time are carefully considering the evidence." "And what if they don't believe the experts?" Sarah asked quietly. "What if they still think I'm lying?" "Then we appeal," said firmly. "But I don't think that's going to happen. You heard how Harrison instructed them. He laid out every piece of exculpatory evidence. He explained your medical condition. He essentially told them that the prosecution's case was built on a misunderstanding." At 3:47 p.m. on the third day of deliberation, a court officer appeared in the cafeteria. "Ms. Mitchell, the jury has reached a verdict." Sarah's hands began to shake. Justice immediately stood, pressing against her handler's leg, providing tactile grounding, squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "Let's go find out the truth," he said quietly. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was taken and people lined the walls 3 deep. The trial had become something of a local phenomenon, the story of a woman with PTSD, a service dog, and a justice system finally correcting its course. News vans had been parked outside the courthouse for days. Social media was filled with discussions about disability rights, PTSD, and service animal training. Sarah walked to the defense table with Justice beside her. The gallery fell silent. Judge Harrison entered, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes locked on Sarah with what she could only interpret as compassion. The jury filed in, and Sarah studied their faces, trying to divine their verdict from subtle expressions. But they gave nothing away. The bailiff stood. "Will the foreperson please stand? Has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman in her 60s, who had been selected as foreperson during jury selection, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendant on the charge of driving under the influence?" The courtroom held its collective breath. Sarah's hand found Justice's fur and gripped it. "Not guilty," the foreperson said clearly. "We find the defendant not guilty." For a moment there was absolute silence. Then the courtroom exploded. Sarah's knees buckled. David caught her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Justice leaped up, placing her paws on Sarah's shoulders in that practiced deep pressure hold, understanding immediately that her handler had a sudden emotional surge and needed grounding intervention. Several courtroom observers were crying openly. Dr. Ellen, Sarah's therapist, was on her feet with tears streaming down her face. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, attempting to restore order. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." As the chaos gradually settled, Harrison addressed the jury. "Members of the jury, thank you for your careful and thorough deliberation. You have rendered a just verdict based on the evidence presented. The defendant is hereby acquitted of all charges. You are dismissed, and the court thanks you for your service." He turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you are free to go. This court formally expunges all charges from your record. I apologize on behalf of this court for the initial misunderstanding of your medical condition and the systemic bias that nearly resulted in a grave miscarriage of justice." His words, spoken with genuine remorse, seemed to carry the weight of institutional acknowledgement. Sarah had been wronged not just by the prosecution, but by the system itself. And now, that system was admitting it. In the gallery, sat motionless, his face drained of color. His perfect conviction record was now blemished. The case that should have been easy had become a public relations disaster. Later that day, the district attorney's office would announce a full review of all of recent cases, concerned that his aggressive tactics might have resulted in other wrongful prosecutions. Officer James was notably absent from the courtroom. His initial police report was now under investigation. The beer can, which appeared to have been planted based on the forensic evidence, raised serious questions about whether he had fabricated evidence or simply been incompetent in his evidence handling. Either way, his credibility was destroyed. As Sarah left the courtroom, reporters surged toward her, shouting questions. But she simply held Justice's leash and walked forward, the dog creating a protective barrier through the crowd. David fielded the questions. "My client has been vindicated by the evidence and the justice system. She looks forward to returning to her teaching career and continuing to build her life with Justice, who was instrumental in bringing the truth to light. That's all I have to say at this time." Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was brilliant and warm on Sarah's face. She stood on the courthouse steps, Justice at her side, and allowed herself to breathe for what felt like the first time in 6 months. A woman approached her, one of the jurors who had voted not guilty. "Ms. Mitchell, I just wanted to say, when we saw your dog intervene, something clicked for me. I realized I'd been making assumptions based on anxiety, not evidence. I'm so glad we got it right." Sarah thanked her, grateful beyond words that at least someone had been willing to look beyond her broken appearance to the truth beneath. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life began to reconstruct itself. The school district welcomed her back to Lincoln Elementary, where her students had missed her desperately. Her colleagues had stood by her throughout the ordeal. Her students made welcome-back signs and hugged her fiercely on her first day back. Justice became something of a celebrity in the school. Children asked to pet her, wanting to touch the dog who had saved their teacher. Sarah used these moments to educate students about PTSD, about service animals, about how disability doesn't mean dishonesty or guilt. The case attracted national attention. Mental health advocacy organizations contacted Sarah, asking her to speak about her experience. Law schools began using the trial as a case study in disability law and the importance of understanding neurological conditions in legal proceedings. Judge Harrison was invited to deliver lectures on recognizing and correcting judicial bias. Most significantly, Ohio began revising its procedures for handling testimony from individuals with PTSD and other trauma-related conditions. New protocols were established to ensure that anxiety and memory difficulties would be considered in context of documented medical conditions, not as indicators of guilt. David wrote an article for a legal journal about the case, titled, "When the System Fails to See, PTSD, Service Dogs, and the Justice System's Blind Spots." The article went viral in legal circles and sparked conversations about systemic bias in courtrooms across the country. 3 months after her acquittal, Sarah stood in her therapist's office with Justice curled up on the dog bed beside her. Doctor looked at her patient with genuine joy. "How are you doing?" the therapist asked. "I'm healing," Sarah said. "I'm still processing the trauma of the trial itself. I'm still dealing with PTSD. But I feel like I can breathe again. And I understand now that my memory problems, my anxiety, they don't make me broken. They make me human, traumatized but human." She reached down and scratched Justice behind the ears. "And this girl, she saved my life, not just in the courtroom but in helping me understand that I deserve to be heard, even when my mind is struggling." Justice's tail thumped against the dog bed, her brown eyes full of the unwavering love and acceptance that had sustained Sarah through her darkest days. Outside the therapist's office, Columbus continued on. But for Sarah Mitchell, the world had fundamentally changed. She had learned that justice wasn't always swift or obvious. It required voices, sometimes human voices, sometimes four-legged voices. It required persistence, evidence, and most importantly, it required someone finally willing to see beyond assumptions to the truth beneath. And sometimes, that someone was a judge willing to admit his mistakes. And sometimes, the most powerful advocate for truth was a golden retriever named Justice, who had been trained to understand that bringing her handler's authentic self back to the present moment was the most important work she could ever do. The trial of State v. Sarah Mitchell would be remembered not as a triumph of prosecution, but as a moment when the system finally got it right. When a woman's disability became, paradoxically, the evidence of her innocence. When a service dog's training became the bridge between suffering and salvation. And when one woman's courage, combined with one dog's unwavering loyalty, changed the course of justice itself.